From the United Nations headquarters in New York, the tension over Iran's nuclear program reached a decisive turning point. On September 26, 2025, diplomats from around the world gathered in the Security Council chamber as a last-ditch proposal by Russia and China to delay the automatic return of sanctions on Tehran's nuclear activities was put to a vote and was rejected. Moments later, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi emerged at the stakeout podium before the assembled press. The atmosphere was tense, the stakes high. Araghchi stepped forward, determined to defend his country's position and to deliver a clear message to both allies and adversaries. As cameras clicked, the Iranian diplomat began in a measured but firm tone. He framed Iran as a country willing to talk, but unwilling to repeat what he called past mistakes. Araghchi said, "Diplomacy is not limited to negotiation with the United States." We have, unfortunately, a terrible experience of negotiating with the United States. This opening remark set the tone. Iran was signaling that talks could happen, but not on Washington's terms. It was a reminder that the history of mistrust between Tehran and Washington continues to weigh heavily on today's negotiations. Reinforcing that message, Araghchi emphasized that while the path of dialogue remained open, it was fraught with greater complexity than before. He declared, "Diplomacy will never die, but it will be certainly more difficult and more complicated than before." That statement captured headlines immediately, portraying Iran as still open to engagement, yet braced for tougher battles ahead. As he concluded his initial remarks, reporters sensed that Tehran was preparing to stand its ground in a high-stakes international standoff. Then came the core of his message, a sharp warning that underscored Tehran's defiance in the face of Western pressure. Araghchi stated, "Iran will never bow to pressure. We respond only to respect." The choice is clear: escalation or diplomacy. The responsibility lies with those who broke their commitments and undermined international law. That statement crystallized Iran's view of the crisis, that the collapse of the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and the return of sanctions were the fault of others, particularly Washington and some European allies, not of Tehran. It portrayed Iran as the aggrieved party willing to talk, but unwilling to surrender. Araghchi turned next to the Security Council vote that had just failed. He remarked, "The Security Council just voted on a draft by China and Russia to give diplomacy another chance." Under US pressure, unfortunately, the Council refused for Tehran. The rejection of the Russia-China resolution was more than a procedural defeat. It was, in Araghchi's telling, proof that Washington's influence still shaped the international system in ways Iran considered unjust. The Iranian diplomat then pivoted to the legal argument at the heart of the crisis. He invoked the 2015 UN Resolution 2231, which had endorsed the JCPOA and laid out a timeline for the eventual lifting of restrictions. Araghchi asserted, "Iran's position on snapback is clear. It is illegal, void, and has no standing. The E3, having breached the deal, cannot claim significant non-performance. Resolution 2231 restrictions will expire permanently on the 18th of October 2025. Any attempt to revive or extend them is null and void." Those words were aimed not only at the United States, but also at Britain, France, and Germany, the so-called E3, whom Iran accuses of failing to deliver on promises of economic relief after the US withdrew from the deal in 2018. Finally, Araghchi made an appeal for diplomacy, seeking to show that Iran remained committed to dialogue even as it denounced what it viewed as unfair treatment. He said, "We have been always ready to engage in diplomacy, and we have proved that. When we negotiated JCPOA, when we negotiated with the United States before the attacks, and every time we were called for that, I came here with clear proposals to give diplomacy more chance. And I regret that the proposals were refused by the other side, so we have to think about the diplomacy rather than confrontation and escalation." By casting himself as a seasoned negotiator whose proposals were rejected, Araghchi sought to shift the blame for the deadlock onto others, particularly the United States and its allies. To fully understand the stakes behind these words, it is important to revisit the history of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, Signed in 2015 between Iran and 6 major powers, the United States, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany, the deal placed significant limits on Iran's nuclear activities, including caps on uranium enrichment levels and stockpiles. In return, Iran gained relief from crippling international sanctions, especially those targeting its oil exports and access to global finance. But in 2018, then US President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the agreement, reinstating sanctions and demanding a tougher deal. Iran, after initially complying for more than a year, gradually rolled back its commitments, increasing uranium enrichment and installing more advanced centrifuges. The snapback mechanism, which allowed UN sanctions to be automatically reimposed if Iran was found to be in violation, became one of the most contested elements of the accord. Tehran argues that since the US left the deal, it has forfeited any right to trigger the mechanism. Western countries disagree, maintaining that Iran's breaches justify renewed restrictions. Friday's Security Council session revealed the new geopolitical fault lines. Russia and China, both now major economic partners of Tehran and critics of US dominance in global affairs, pushed for a 6-month extension to the JCPOA framework. They argued that giving diplomacy more time could avert another escalation and prevent further destabilization in the Middle East. The United States, backed by several European powers, opposed the measure, saying Iran must first roll back its enriched uranium stockpile and halt the operation of advanced centrifuges. The rejection of the Russia-China resolution thus reflected not only differences over Iran's program, but also the broader rivalry between East and West. The implications for Iran's already strained economy are severe. A full return of UN sanctions would further restrict Tehran's access to international markets, deepening the hardship of a population already grappling with high inflation, a depreciating currency, and limits on essential imports. Iranian officials, however, argue that by standing firm and refusing to bow to pressure, they strengthen their negotiating hand and bolster their image at home as defenders of national sovereignty. Beyond the economic stakes, the nuclear standoff carries significant regional security risks. Gulf Arab neighbours remain wary of Iran's nuclear ambitions, fearing both a potential arms race and further destabilization. Israel has repeatedly warned that it will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon and has hinted at the possibility of military action if diplomacy fails. For Middle East watchers, these dynamics heighten the risk of a wider conflict should talks break down. Many diplomats fear that the absence of a negotiated settlement could fuel new proxy confrontations across the region, from Yemen to Lebanon, further destabilizing an already fragile region. Reactions to Araghchi's statements were swift. European diplomats expressed regret over the Council's deadlock, but urged all sides to keep channels of communication open. The United States dismissed Tehran's accusations as political theatre, insisting that Iran must first return to compliance with its nuclear obligations before expecting any relief. Analysts point out that while Tehran's rhetoric is often defiant, Araghchi's repeated assertion that diplomacy will never die suggests that Iran still sees negotiations as the most viable way forward, provided it can do so without appearing to surrender to outside pressure. Attention now shifts to October 18, 2025, the date on which restrictions under UN Resolution 2231 are set to expire. If no new understanding is reached by then, Western powers may pursue their own measures outside the UN framework, possibly including fresh unilateral sanctions. For Iran, this looming deadline is both an opportunity and a risk. It strengthens Tehran's legal argument that attempts to revive snapback sanctions are invalid once the restrictions expire, yet it also underscores the urgency for all parties to find a diplomatic off-ramp before time runs out. In his appearance at the UN, Abbas Araghchi projected resilience and determination, portraying Iran as a nation wronged but still open to dialogue. Whether that message succeeds in reopening negotiations or merely entrenches the divisions among major powers remains to be seen. What is undeniable is that the dispute over Iran's nuclear program, nearly 2 decades in the making, has entered yet another critical chapter. As the deadline approaches, the world is watching to see whether the stark choice outlined by Araghchi, escalation or diplomacy, will be resolved at the negotiating table or on the battlefield of sanctions and confrontation.
Diplomacy is not limited to negotiation with the United States. We have, unfortunately, a terrible experience of negotiating with the United States. Diplomacy would never die, but it would be certainly more difficult and more complicated than before.
Mr. Minister, may I ask a question to Camelia?
And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Iran will never bow to pressure. We respond only to respect. The choice is clear: escalation or diplomacy. The responsibility lies with those who broke their commitments and undermined international law. And thank you. The Security Council just voted on a draft by China and Russia to give diplomacy another chance. Under US pressure, unfortunately, the Council refused. This is the second. Iran's position on snapback is clear. It is illegal, void, and has no standing. The E3, having breached the deal, cannot claim significant non-performance. Resolution 2231 restrictions will expire permanently on 18 October 2025. Any attempt to revive or extend them is null and void. We have been always ready to engage in diplomacy, and we have proved that when we negotiated JCPOA, when we negotiated with the United States before the attacks, and every time we were called for that. I came here with clear proposals to give diplomacy more chance, and I regret that the proposals were refused by the other side. So we have to think about the diplomacy rather than confrontation and escalation.